Thank you very much for attending the conference that you've been waiting on. This is the last of the day, except for lunch, of course, with General Abbott. But we're really glad you're here. We appreciate you attending, whether it's been today or all 3 days, whatever. It's important that you're here, and we appreciate you for that. This discussion will be, it's entitled The Budget, Realities of the 83rd Legislative Session. Now, what I'd like to do is to take a look at transparency of the budget, how the budget numbers are reported. I'm Talmadge Heflin. I'm the director of the Center for Fiscal Policy at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We have a panel that knows about the budget, one that should know about it, and then we have two that know about it because they wrote it the last time and several times before the Texas budget. But we think it's important that the public understands the budget, that it's presented in a transparent way. And last session, it was reported, and accurately so, that the legislature adopted a budget that stayed within the growth rate when you look at budget to budget. But the previous budget cycle, there was some things left unfunded, and so the legislature, when they came to town, they had to fund those things before they started with the current budget for 14 and 15. And as you remember, in 2011, we were a little short of cash, so everything wasn't funded. And when we got into town, when the legislature came to town in 2013, there was cash in the bank, thank goodness. And so they were able to fill those holes and go about doing the things that they collectively felt they needed to do, rightfully so. And it was reported in the same fashion that it's been reported for decades. LBB goes from one budget to the next. The legislature adopts an appropriation bill. Money is starting to be spent. If they go over and they come back and backfill that, that's counted on the previous budget, and it raises the floor for the next budget to start. Been reported like that forever. But it leaves a little gap in there, is what I call truing up. I tried for years to get the LBB to true up from one session to the next and talk about the budget creep, why you spent more than what you appropriated. And so in this last session, we reported it in a way that showed kind of a biennium and a half, and I think it might be good in the future if we showed two bienniums, but still show the budget to budget how much it increased from one time to the next. So I'm hoping in our discussion today, our panelists not only inform you of what took place, but how it might be best reported in the future so that more people can understand how they dealt with your money and what you got for your money, because they're good stewards of your money. And it's just a matter of you understanding what they funded and what we expect to get for that. I'm going to ask the panelists when they come, can you hear me in the back? I mean, way in the back. Okay, I see a guy waving outside the window out there. I guess we're okay. But I understand if we don't speak close to the mic, we won't be heard. So I'm going to ask the panelists whether you're making a presentation here. We'll give you about 10 minutes, or if you're answering a question, to stay close to the mic. Now, we have a timekeeper. We had a oh, there he is. He moved on me. He said he's going to be over there. He's going to be over here. I want you to know, I want you to see where he is. He's going to warn you at 5 minutes, and he's going to give you a minute or two, and then a hook at 10 minutes or so. we try to confine our remarks to about 10 minutes. But let's get on with we have State Representative Sylvester Turner. He's been a state rep from District 139 in Harris County forever. Elected in the late 1800s, or at least 1988 or something like that.
5 years, Talmadge. 5 years. 5 years.
At any rate, Representative Turner is he went to University of Houston, got a law degree from a Harvard Law School. He's been in private practice. He currently has a firm that he practices, Barnes and Turner, and he serves on the Appropriations Committee. He's been on nearly every conference committee since I can remember. He's the vice chairman of the Appropriations Committee, so he knows what's going on with the budget. We had next to him Representative John Otto, by his standards, a fairly newcomer, elected in 2004, but Representative John Otto got busy real quick. He's a CPA. He, I believe, an Aggie as well, and went to work very quickly on the budget and also on Ways and Means. So he not only takes your money, he spends it. So we're pleased to have two experts in that regard. We have next to Representative Otto, the Honorable Chuck DeVore. Chuck spent some time. He was misguided. I think he grew up on the West Coast, somewhere around California, served in the Assembly. We call it the House of Representatives over here, but it's the Assembly in California until he was term limited out. He's been in the aerospace industry. He almost became a U.S. Senator from California. And then he decided to also had a distinguished career both in the Reagan White House as an appointee to the Pentagon and also served our country. He's a U.S. retired Army Reserve and holds the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. And we're pleased to have Chuck currently serving as our Vice President for Policy at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. So he not only came to his senses, got out of California, but he came and decided to lend us a hand. We appreciate that. Next to him, we have Dr. Brian Dimitrovic, professor at Sam Houston State University. He's chairman of the Department of History and is a senior associate of the Laffer Center for Supply Side Economics. He writes prolifically. He's been published, in addition to books, he's been published in the Wall Street Journal, Investors Daily, Business Daily, and Forbes.com. We'll start with Dr. Dimitrovic. We'll go to Chuck DeVore, and then Representative Otto, and then Representative Turner. Then if we have enough time, there might be something provocative said by some of the panelists. So if another panelist wants to question them, we'll give them a brief moment to do that. But we hope to reserve some time so that if you have questions, we can get to those questions here before we wrap it up. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brian.
Thank you very much, Talmadge. What I have to say really is just to develop the great point that was made by Phil Graham this morning, by Senator Graham. There is so much at stake in Texas not going the big government route in the context of its legendary prosperity. If Texas fails on that score, there will be no model in the world of any place significant doing that. Recently, a lion of Texas history died. This was T.R. Fehrenbach, the fascinating scholar and Princeton alum who wrote the most beloved history of Texas ever written, Lone Star, back in 1968. Lone Star is an interesting book, to say the least. Perhaps most pertinent from our perspective in 2014 is that in the book, Fehrenbach rather belittled modern Texas history, 20th century Texas history. Fehrenbach thought that the essence of the Texas experience was the 19th century, when the state became a nation and then joined the United States. and farming and ranching and community created a special kind of American, an American who knew how to hew out a good communal existence out of the stuff of this great expanse of land. I go into this historical reflection because time has passed. The 20th century, as it turns out, was in fact very good to Texas. I think that Mr. Fehrenbach did not like it so much because it smacked more of business and materialism, if not consumerism and traffic, than did the halcyon founding days of Texas. But let there be no mistake. One thing Texas did in the 20th century, like many other places in this country, such as California, is discover the means of delivering prosperity on a mass scale to truly millions upon millions of people. But of course, the 20th century itself firmly belongs to the past. We are now nearly a decade and a half into the 21st century. And it is becoming clear that over the great span of Texas history, stretching back over the centuries, this 21st century of ours, right now, is one of the singular moments in all of Lone Star history. I say this in view of the great economic stagnation that has gripped this country, and by extension, a great part of the developed world, including all of Europe, for essentially the entire 21st century. There was some decent, actually modest, economic growth in the United States and the world in the first several years of the 2000s. However, since 2007 and the onset of the Great Recession, and then its crummy aftermath, growth has been totally substandard. By the usual measurements, it has not even been at the rate of 2% per year in recovery. All told, since 2007, the developed world economy has essentially been stagnant. But not, of course, Texas. Texas has bloomed in the 21st century, including since 2007 and the coming of the Great Recession worldwide. Its housing market, remember, was the most normal in the entire nation throughout all of that problem. Its entrepreneurialism, job growth, attractiveness to immigrants, and population increase have all been legendary, and all since 2007. In fact, throughout the entire period of economic crisis with which we have had to contend for these last 7 years, nationally, internationally, there is only one major place in the entire developed world that has been stellar economically the whole while, and this is Texas. You can say that China has done okay over this period, but note that China is not properly part of the developed world quite yet. It is a follower more than a leader, and it sneezes when the United States catches a cold. You can say that North Dakota has done very well of late, but North Dakota is small and remote. There is no other significant central place across what we once referred to as the First World that has been a model of economic expansion and vigor across the whole world, other than Texas these last 7 years, since the start of the Great Recession. Without Texas, indeed, there would be no model at all, globally, of how to get right again. It is conceivable that had there been no Texas when the Great Recession hit, there would have been no break on the Keynesian response from governments the world over, including the United States, because there would have been no example of success doing it the other way. This is how valuable Texas's recent prosperity has been, not only to this country, but to the world. Thus, I wish to make the point that Texas sure has grown up into full adulthood of late. Gone are the days where we can be a little indifferent, as I do think T.R. Fehrenbach might have been, about the mightiness of Texas's economic success and mass prosperity. Texas now shoulders an obligation for the whole world of showing developed places how to get the good times going again. It is essential that this obligation continue to be met by this great state. Now, the secret to keeping up the Texas success story is, of course, no secret at all. It is to meet the challenge of prosperity by keeping government small. The one thing that prosperity will do is toss off tax receipts to government. This most certainly has been the case in Texas. We know all the numbers. Where I live in the Woodlands, every year it is a whopping new story of by what double-digit rate tax rates, without receipts, without any increase in tax rates, have plowed into the municipal coffers. It's always a double-digit increase in receipts without any increase in rates. And so it is the same across the state. Tax receipts are way up with the big economic growth, and all through what nationally we call the era of the Great Recession. The thing that Texas has to concentrate on now, not only to continue and indeed improve its good times, but to fulfill its very grave obligations to the nation and the world is not to spend the money. The world is littered with examples of places that got rich and then got eaten alive by their governments, which also got rich. These are terrible models for a world economy yearning for real and permanent recovery. California is the primary example of this sorry and all too familiar trend. By the way, did you see that Governor Jerry Brown had a news conference yesterday in California about how he's going to spend the surplus of $4.6 billion in California, which, by the way, amounts to $100 for every resident of California. They're going to have he's going to plow it into the high-speed rail, $68 billion, and he's going to accommodate the unions. He said this surplus means we can accommodate the unions. Yeah, that's what you can do with tax receipts. You can just, get government big. And no one else is doing it. No other significant place is doing this other than Texas, doing it right. Practically, what all this means for Texas in the legislature is that taxes have to be cut. There is no way that this state can endure the bounty of tax receipts and maintain its status as a free market paragon unless it refuses all these new receipts in the form of tax cuts. For if taxes are not cut, and considerably in this state, the implication will be clear that the revenue gusher is going to be used for new spending. Now remember, as the great economist Arthur Laffer, who's an old mainstay at these TPPF orientations, by the way, as Laffer has always taught, and specifically with regard to the states, good tax cuts lead to increases in receipts. This leads to a virtuous circle whereby tax cuts beget growth, receipts beget more tax cuts, which in turn yields more growth and more tax cuts on and on into the future. This is the opportunity Texas has. You have really good times, you have bounteous tax receipts, that's because you had low taxes to begin with. We'll cut them again. You'll have more receipts, then you cut taxes again. It's a virtuous circle. In the 83rd Legislature controversy, I am very satisfied, and I wrote about this in my Fords.com column, that the budget masters played games in their aggregate spending comparisons. They said that state spending was not increasing so much at a long-term rate. But they picked a favorable comparison year back in the early 2000s, a peak year of previous spending. If you picked a trough year in the past or an average of past years, which would be statistically legitimate, it was easy to see that the spending level agreed to by the 83rd indicated that Texas was embarking on the road to spending the revenue gusher. As I hope I have made clear, it would simply be terrible, and for so many people truly the world over, if Texas were to follow this route. The moment for spending vigilance has never been more imperative for Texas than it is now. If we spend the tax receipt bounty here, where will the world turn for a good big example of how to maintain the kind of mass prosperity first ushered in by the Industrial Revolution? To Washington? To California? To even suggest this as a joke. Texas is the only big example of doing it the right way. If there really are projects to be funded here in Texas, then current expenditures should be cut to finance these new projects. It is imperative for the global 21st century that Texas cultivate the greatest seriousness it can muster about its mandate to cut taxes and limit and then shrink spending. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Doctor. That I thought was a wonderful historic overview. What I'd like to do with my remarks is kind of bifurcate them with a little bit of comparative analysis between the two biggest states where 1/5 of Americans live, as well as in our recently concluded legislative session. As Talmadge was kind of joshing with me, I did see the light and moved to Texas as quickly as I could. I represented about 500,000 people in Southern California in the communities of Irvine and Newport Beach and Laguna Beach, very beautiful place, but also in a very high tax, large bureaucracy state. I was on the Revenue and Taxation Committee, I was on the Budget Committee, and got to see firsthand how not to do it in the Golden State, and came to Texas a little over 2 years ago. Well, one of the things that I really enjoy when looking at the two biggest states is that they are so alike in so many different ways. Demographically, they're almost mirror images of each other when you look at racial and ethnic groups. They both are blessed with abundant natural resources, with long coastlines, with borders with Mexico, robust international trade, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, in one area that really counts, they couldn't be the more opposite, and that's in the area of governance. of regulation, of taxation. And that's where public policy is really made, and that's where we can see some of these differences. And what I find is that when you begin to look at the numbers in an honest way, begin to account for things like cost of living differences, and you look at, for example, new U.S. Census Bureau poverty statistics that take into account cost of living and the value of government benefits and the effect of taxation, what you find is that with populations that are virtually identical, that California has proportionately 45% more people living in poverty than does Texas. They also tax 42% more of their income at the state and local level than does Texas. And this leads to some very divergent outcomes. For example, you often hear criticism in Texas about our public education establishment, and certainly we would like to see reforms, but let's not criticize Texas unduly. For example, our student-to-teacher ratio, according to the very liberal National Education Association, is actually better than the national average and significantly better than last place California. And so that's something you never hear when you hear people ask for more and more and more money. So as we look at Texas and we understand where it is, let's not unduly criticize Texas in the context of the rest of the country. That yes, Texas has relatively a frugal government, but it also spends money more in areas than its critics will often give it credit for. So then let's look and begin to focus on the budget. If you look at state and local spending as a share of income, today is about the same as what it was back in the late 1970s, according to the Tax Foundation, about 7.9%. And some people would say, well, isn't that great? We've held spending at the same share of income. But did you know in that period of time, the average household spent about 13% of its budget on food, and that's now down to about 7.5%? Where is it written that as we become more prosperous, that government has a steady amount that we owe it, kind of like a tithe? One would think that as there's general prosperity increasing, that we would need less government as a share of the economy. And where are all the productivity improvements that we've seen? You know, bureaucrats didn't have laptops or personal computers back in 1978, and they do today. But we seem to still need the same number of them, even in Texas. And so then as we get into the budget, and we look at this last budget cycle, Talmadge Heflin, who wrote a few budgets or two in his day, talked about the cycle, the biennial cycle, and the fact that as you go into a new biennium, one of the tools, to use a kind word that's used by the budget writers, is they can backfill the previous biennium, thus increasing the base of the new biennium so that you can spend more in the new biennium. And one of the things that was done in this last legislative session is not only was that done, but the budget writers allowed that new money put into the old budget to be spent over a 3-year period. So it wasn't just money put in that could be spent until the expiration of the old budget, but money that could be spent for the next 2 years. And so one of the criticisms that we had at the foundation, and again, these disagreements we view to be among friends, and certainly, budgets can generate sharp conflict, but we're hoping that we're still communicating and discussing these things. But one of the criticisms that we had was you had an enormous windfall of new money coming into the budget, and as Talmadge mentioned, backfilled a partial funding of Medicaid was the main thing, and education as well. And then, going forward, spending was kept at the same rate, but then if you looked at the additional money that was spent over and above what it was needed just to make things whole, we're talking about billions of additional dollars out of this windfall that we received. And the budget writers said, well, gee, we're growing no faster than what the limits allow. Now remember, that's after backfilling the previous budget so that they raised the base. Our concern at the foundation was that there is a legitimate call for additional spending for infrastructure, for example, on transportation, on water. But what the budget writers did was that to spend that money in the existing budget would have caused what? the breaking of the budget cap. And so what the budget writers did was put that money aside and asked you, the voters, to vote to approve it so it wouldn't count toward the spending limit. Now, it wasn't too long ago in Texas budget writing history that, for example, roads had a relatively large claim on general revenue. We funded a significant amount of our transportation needs with general revenue 20 years ago, as recent as 20 years ago or less. But today, other spending priorities have crowded out road spending. And further, we've taken the gas tax that was to be dedicated to the roads and we spent it on other things somewhat related to transportation, like the Department of Public Safety. And that way, we're using dollars that were dedicated for roads and we're using it to offset what previously had been general revenue spending. Are you beginning to understand how the tools of the budget writing kind of allow the budget writers to look frugal even while spending more money than perhaps some of us feel comfortable with? Now, going back to what Dr. Dimitrovic was saying, why is this so important? It's important because when you begin to spend more money and spending discipline begins to erode, what inevitably happens is government begins to grow. And when you have more bureaucrats, what do bureaucrats tend to do? Well, they tend to write rules. They tend to justify their existence by kind of telling us what to do with our lives. Now, again, relative to other states, Texas is pretty good in that department. In fact, we're number 2 to Indiana. Indiana, after Mitch Daniels, actually has the most efficient bureaucracy in the country. But we're Texas. Why aren't we number 1? Are we comfortable with Indiana being more efficient than us from a bureaucratic standpoint? I mean, I don't know. That doesn't sound to me to be very Texan. And so what we would suggest is we need to look at the budget differently than we have in recent years. What we have today is what's called a kind of a strategic level budget. And instead of funding strategies where the legislature has kind of a broad outline of spending for various like human resources or transportation, et cetera, Texas ought to go and have more of a line item spending budget where the lawmakers have more control vis-a-vis the executive branch and understand to the level of spending authority for each line item, which bureaucrat is in charge of which department, how much are they spending from year to year, how many full-time equivalents do they have in that department from year to year. And by the way, so that you then, the public, can also see that, because under our current budget layout in Texas, it is very, very difficult to understand exactly where we're spending money from year to year and who works for what department doing what thing. And by the way, that change was made within the last 20 years, and it was made, I think, to kind of obfuscate what's going on. It gives far more power to the governor and to the speaker and to the lieutenant governor, and less to the public and to the individual elected representatives. So we need to get back to the role where the appropriators understand to the fine detail what is being spent by their state so that they can exercise the legitimate control that the people who sent them to Austin expect them to exercise. So I very much look forward to hearing from our 2 members of the legislature upcoming, and then having some very interesting Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Talmadge, for inviting me to be here today. When I was originally asked to come and serve on this panel, I was told the topic was going to be talking about the changes from the 12-13 to the 14-15 budget, some of what's been referred to here today. I'm going to try to stay out of the weeds. Being an accountant, that's sometimes tough for me, but I want to try to give you an overview of what those of us that were working on the budget, what we went through. First of all, let me talk a little bit about, and let me just throw in, I wish y'all had shown a comparison of the 10-11 versus the 12-13 budget while we were here also. because you would have seen it was about a $25 billion cut between those two biennia. So I do agree that you have to be very careful about cherry picking what years you're looking at when you're talking about a trend in state spending. If we start out with last session, when, or let me go back to the 82nd session in 2011. When we arrived, we were given a budget revenue estimate to start our work with of $77 billion, 77,308, okay? That's the number we were given. Now I want to, using that number, we then realized we can't, you know, and understand the reason we were given that number is the biennium before that, we had $12 billion in stimulus money that had to be taken out of the budget. So it was no longer available. Plus, we were in the recession, and our revenues were down. So this was the number we were given. That's what we started with. The decision to underfund Medicaid and enact a foundation school program deferral, that's a total of $6.6 billion in cost reduction at the time, were two actions that were taken among many to address the shortfall. And both are useful state budgeting tools. Talmadge, I know in 2003 you yourself used a deferral because when I first showed up in 2005, I started asking, where is this money going that we're looking at? And it was going to start to reverse those deferrals. A lot of people refer to that as gimmicks. Folks, it's a gimmick if you do it and don't reverse it. If I'm a company and I all of a sudden have a decline in my revenues, if I'm out there in the private sector and I'm not collecting the revenue I thought I was going to collect, what's the first thing I do? I go to my payables clerk and said, you're not 30 days anymore, you're 60 days when you pay, okay? Now, over time, you get back to that 30 days. You don't let that become permanent, because if you do, that is a gimmick and you've just taken a tool out of your toolbox that you can no longer use. So it's important that you put those tools back in. So when we did this, no one paying attention to what we did back then could have construed that those reductions were permanent. Members and staff were all completely upfront about the need to address both of these actions, and absolutely the necessity of funding the Medicaid in 2013 in the supplemental appropriations bill. Folks, we only funded 18 months of a 24-month budget in Medicaid. Now, you say, well, you should have come up with the money from somewhere else. Well, we cut education, public education, $5 billion. To fully fund Medicaid, we would have had to cut it another $4 to $5 billion. I couldn't vote for that. $5 billion cut was about where my limit was on that. We also had a rainy day fund of $6.6 billion. The decision was made not to spend that, to leave it there. Now, 2020 hindsight, guess what? It's a good thing we didn't, because we didn't need to spend the rainy day fund. Why? Remember that revenue estimate I told you about? Well, let's look at it after we updated it, when we get to what's called the certification revenue estimate. Let me find my notes. The certification revenue estimate, remember, let me go back and repeat. We started that budget at $77.3 billion. The certification budget, or the certification estimate, was $93 billion. Folks, if we had the revenue estimate was missed by 20%. I'm not faulting the comptroller. We were in difficult situation, volatility. We were in a bad recession. Nobody knew what it was going to be. I'm not trying to lay fault here. I'm trying to paint the picture that if we had been told a true reflection of what the general revenue actually ended up being, we wouldn't be having this discussion about backfilling, because we would have used that at that time. So, you know, people say, well, how's the best way to go about comparing? Well, I noticed y'all handed out a sheet here yesterday, and I looked at that, and it appears to me you were trying to compare one legislative session to another legislative session. Folks, you cannot do that. A budget is a two-year budget that is, when we go into session, we are acting on two budgets. We are cleaning up, truing up the one that was adopted 2 years ago, and it was an estimate. That's what a budget is. And we're working on the one for the next 2 years based on an estimate. So if you come out and say that we increased spending by 24%, no, we didn't. We didn't increase spending. Not if you do a true comparison of the spending in the base year to the spending in the final budget year. And in order to do that, you've got to wait till that supplemental bill is done and passed and signed by the governor. The best thing that we have to date is what LBB, and it's on their website right now. It's called a Trends in State Government Expenditures, Table 1. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 biennia history out there. And it shows unadjusted numbers, and it shows numbers adjusted for combined population and inflation growth. So I would say, now let me just say, that's not perfect. And let me tell you why. In here, they put in a footnote, and you got to read the footnotes. They put in here that in the 14-15, we removed both the revenue and the expenditures of patient income for health-related education, higher educational institutions. Should have never probably been in there to start with, but there are health-related institutions who are funded based upon, in part, upon their patient income. MD Anderson is one of them. So that number was in there. Well, we removed it. Well, but we didn't go back and restate all the prior biennia to make them consistent with that. So I'll be the first to admit, when we made that change, it made it look like we cut higher ed spending. We didn't. We just removed a patient revenue and a patient expenditure out of the state budget that probably should have never been in there to start with. So I welcome the chance. I do think, while we're having the discussion, it is important that we get to a point where we can all agree on what we're comparing. Because as a CPA, I'd have to give you an adverse opinion on whether or not this is truthful. To me, it's not, because it does not take into account, we have a spending cap, and somebody said, well, we backfill. Even when we're backfilling on the supplemental, we're still subject to the spending cap that was adopted for that biennia. Now, we can have a conversation about whether that spending cap ought to be lowered. That's fine. But the legislature is operating under that spending cap. We're well aware of it. Nobody likes to take that vote to break it. But I hope in the future that we can arrive at some way. I used to be an auditor. I spent most of my life auditing Mitchell Energy and Development, George Mitchell's company, when he went public. And when we had a change in accounting, we had to go back and change those prior years so that they were consistent to reflect a comparison. Right now today, folks, we don't have that. Nobody's putting out a really true comparison where you're comparing apples to apples. LBB is closest, but even theirs, unless you read the footnotes and make adjustments to it, you're not getting a true comparison. So I hope that as a result of this meeting today, we can all agree that, yes, we need to get to something that everybody can agree on so that we have a place to start a discussion about the changes we need to make. Thank you.
Let me say good morning. Talmadge told me that he wanted to save me for last because I was the most conservative person on this panel. I appreciated that characterization, and so I hope to live up to what he told me. Let me quickly say that we are not California. Even Democrats in Texas do not try to emulate California. So let me just say that. So that's not the case. I will say to you, and I think that we all can agree, that the budgetary process in the state of Texas is in need of greater transparency. I think we can all agree there. Secondly, I do think we do need to line up, and I agree with what Representative Otto had to say, so that we are comparing apples to apples, because it is easy in the budgetary process to get get things confusing when we are comparing budgets that we passed in one year, and then we come back in the next session and we're dealing with supplementals and where you're going to place those numbers, it becomes quite confusing. So I do agree that we do need to kind of line things up structurally so we know exactly what we're talking about. And then, of course, for those who are familiar with the Legislative Budget Board, even before the legislature starts, we determine what the spending levels will be. And I think Talmadge and others will agree that the Legislative Budget Board always start off with very modest projections. Even though I would have probably voted for something else, those projections have always been modest because we always wanted to make sure that we don't spend every dime that we have. I think that's a great process, and I think that's one that we will continue. And then secondly, we of course obligated to have a balanced budget. Let me just start off in 2003. When my friend Talmadge was the chair of appropriations on the House side, when my friend Arlene Wogamuth was also on the Commerce Committee, along with myself in 2003, and when we faced a $10 billion budgetary shortfall, one thing that we did then is that we engaged in zero-based budgeting, Talmadge, if you can remember. And basically, well, we just started off from zero. Because I agree, you can have budgetary creep. You can always, in every budget cycle, you're always adding on top. You say we'll do 2%, we'll do 4%, do 6%. In some cases, you don't need to do any percent. In some cases, programs have become outdated, and they're no longer needed. So you don't need to continue to fund something where the need no longer exists. And so I think every now and then, whether it's every 5 years, every 10 years, I think you need to go back to zero-based budgeting and force every agency to justify their expenditures and whether or not the need still exists. I agree with that. And I will tell you in that process, at that point in time, I chaired the subcommittee on criminal justice, and we were given a set amount of money to spend. The Speaker gave me a set amount and told me that's all I was going to spend. We went through that process on criminal justice, and we slashed things to get within that budget. Slashed it. I went back to the Speaker and I said, this is how much you wanted, this is how much you gave me, and this is what we can do with what you gave me, and here it is. But I will not put my name on it. You will have to put your name on it because the system is no longer functional. And so in many cases, you have to be very careful if the budget drives the policy or whether or not the true need drives the policy. And then in return, Thomas, you can recall, he ended up giving me $300 to $400 million more and said, make the system functional, make it work, make it secure. And that's exactly what we did. But I would say every 5-10 years, probably need to go through that system to try to make sure so you can eliminate as much as you can budget creep. We did that in 2003. And then in 2006, we reduced our property taxes by 1/3. We changed the system somewhat. We had some projections, and then it's come to find out that many of those projections did not work, and then property appraisals continue to increase, and so we ran into some problems there. We need to address some areas in that regards to make sure that we know exactly what we're doing as it relates to that. In 2003, in addition to that, there was an amendment where we cut taxes, we provided some exemptions by $1 billion. Most of us didn't vote on it, it happened. But I'm saying all of this to say, it's not just on the spending side, but even in the budgetary side, we've imposed exemptions that become continuous and ongoing. And that exemption in 2003 continues to pull about $1 billion out of our system every single year. And so you have to factor all of that in. In 2011, when we faced, some would say anywhere from a $15 to a $27 billion deficit, we engaged in some tremendous cuts. Public school financing was cut by $5.4 million. And so we went through all of that. But I think the point that I want to emphasize, by trying to stay way up here and not getting too close down there, is that we pass a budget in one legislative session that does not go into effect until 3 or 4 months later in September. Pass it in May, doesn't go into effect until September 1. It's based on projections. Many times those projections are uncertain, but you end up doing the best you can when you're preparing a budget, a 2-year budget that's based on projections where the revenue is uncertain. You're going to run into some problems. And as it relates to 2011, when we made those cuts, we come back in 2013. At the beginning of the session, the comptroller says that we've got $8.8 billion in 2013 that we more than what had been projected. And so it kind of puts budgetary writers in somewhat of a bind. And then you try to prepare a budget based on projections that are coming in, based on numbers that were highly uncertain. It's also important to recognize in the state of Texas, when you exclude federal funds that have direct strings attached to them, and when you exclude constitutionally dedicated revenues that have a specific constitutional dedicated purpose, appropriators are only dealing with about 15 to 20% of the dollars anyway. Most of the dollars in the state of Texas are already driven. And so whether I'm a Republican or whether I'm a Democrat, whether I'm a flaming conservative, as Talmadge has called me today, the reality is when I'm sitting at the table as a budget writer, most of the decisions on how dollars are spent in the state of Texas are not within my purview. They are already gone. When it comes to health care spending, the $4 billion that we did not appropriate because the money was not there, that we put on what I call the Medicaid credit card, that we came back and dealt with in 2013, those were entitlement dollars. And they had to be paid. Whether we like them or not, they had to be paid. We had no choice. That's not a Texas budgetary writer criticism. Now, whether we agree or not, driven by DC policy, we are obligated to follow DC policy, and we are obligated to pay the tab. We simply chose not to pay the tab in 2011. We chose to pay it in the supplemental in 2013, but it goes to 2011. Those are the realities. Those are the realities. That's simply the way it is. Now, with regard to spending so much, I have to take issue with that. I have to, because let me just take one example, mental health funding. In this last legislative session, we appropriated about $250 million. Got 2 minutes, okay. Now, is that the conservative time or the liberal time? Okay. I just want to keep it straight, you know. So with respect to mental health funding, we appropriated $250 million over and above. Now, some may say, hey, is that a liberal thing? But when we started the session, per capita spending for mental health in the state of Texas, Texas was 51 out of 51. The national average was $111 per capita for mental health. In the state of Texas, it was 36. It was 36. So is that a bad thing to increase funding for mental health? I think people would rather spend money to address the mental health issue than having a fight about trying to regulate somebody's guns. And so as a budget writer, I thought it was more transformative and more productive and more cost efficient to do that rather than spend up a lot of time on some other extraneous issues where it wasn't going to see the light of day. I think that's a good thing. And when it comes to mental health funding, and I know we can disagree, but Texas has, as long as I've been in the legislature, Texas has never been generous when it comes to health care funding. My point of view, my view, especially as it relates to mental health. In fact, under Arlene Wugamuth, we reduced the number of agencies from about 12 to 14, and we pared them down to about 4 or 5. Okay? When it comes to criminal justice, we have reduced the amount of money that we're having to spend on building prisons, along with the Texas Policy Foundation. We are closing 2, not building another, okay? We're closing them because the diversionary programs are working, and now we are model in the country. Now, correctional health care for the inmates that are there continues on an upward trajectory, and we need to pull that in because that is a cost driver. So when it comes to education, the number of kids going into our system, that's a cost driver. Even if you don't increase anything else, that's a cost driver. In healthcare, the caseload growth, That's a cost driver, even if you don't increase the numbers. On correctional in prisons, correctional managed health care, that's a cost driver. Transportation. Do you know how many people are coming to the state of Texas? The infrastructure needs to be sound if you want businesses to do their job. That's a cost driver. I close by saying this. I agree with the first speaker. Texas has done a lot of things right. But I think it's unfair to criticize budget writers who have produced balanced budgets, stayed under the spending cap, done some things that have done them well, and still get criticized for a conservative budget, for a person like me still believes you haven't done enough. We haven't done enough, okay? But I do think that the criticism, with all due respect, is unfair. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the panel. Let me just say, you know, when Republicans or more conservatives got control of the House for the first time in 2003, the Speaker always kind of appoints their right-hand person. It's not unusual that they will stay within the same party that they're in. But I just want to point out that Representative Turner served as Speaker Pro Tem for several years under Tom Craddock as his right-hand man. So you might get an idea about why I invited him, not only because we served a number of years together, but he truly is one that can bridge the gap. So we thank you for that. Are there any questions among the panelists, of other panelists? No questions. All right. How much time do we have? My timekeeper's lost his watch. All right. Do we have a mic? Somebody carrying the mic around? One of you guys grab. Okay, here comes a tough guy, body fat of 2%. So if he takes the mic away from you, you better pay attention. All right. Do we have any questions of the panel? Right back here.
This question is for anyone who wants to weigh in, but Michael Quinn Sullivan has one of his famous one-liners about the Texas budget is that Texas may be the least drunk state at the bar, but that does not mean we should get behind the wheel. Coming up in 2015 in the 84th Legislature, what sort of 1 to 3 steps do you think we could take that would enable us to be able to drive safely?
If I could start off with that, I'd like to give a plug for Representative Turner's zero-based budgeting. Talmadge and I authored a paper a couple of years ago on that exact topic. And what we would recommend is that on a 4 to 8 year cycle, about 1/3 of the state budget would be reviewed every 4 to 8 years. So no less than 8 years, no more than 4 years, because using lessons learned from places like Georgia that tried to do it every budget cycle, it proved to be exhausting for both lawmakers and the members of the executive branch that had to produce the numbers. And so that is a very important tool to, as Representative Turner correctly said, to revisit things that maybe are now obsolete programs and ought to be eliminated. So that's one huge step. Another I mentioned, which is the moving away from this strategic-based budgeting to program-based budgeting. You want to have line item visibility such that lawmakers can look at a granular level, know how many full-time equivalents are in each department, what is their mission, how does that mission tie back to the Constitution or to statute, rather than conglomerating things together such that you have, in some cases, dozens or hundreds of programs that are under a single umbrella, for example, education or healthcare. And that way, budget writers can truly have visibility, and the public and the press can truly have visibility as to what exactly is being spent. And I think those two steps are very necessary and would go a long way toward responsible budget writing that would allow the public and the lawmakers to know exactly what's being spent.
Let me just add one thing to that. One of the things that was done in the transportation bill is TxDOT is subject to exactly what they're talking about up here. That's already in statute, that they're going to go through that this next session. I think you will see other agencies. The key is we're only here for 140 days. So it's something that you literally, I think, would have to do in the interim. It's not something you can wait till session to take up. But I think you will see the beginning of essentially doing a budget sunset because we don't do that currently. But TxDOT's already on the list to be looked at.
Any other? Next question.
Thank you. Thank you. You talked about zero-based budgeting periodically. That's good. How do you feel about sunsetting tax breaks that target specific industries like the high-cost natural tax exemption? It may have been certainly merited at one time, but as these industries have proven to be very profitable, may no longer be necessary.
Well, I think it should apply on both ends of the equation. Just like spending, you can have budgetary creep on one end. You can also have exemptions that are put in place that were needed at one point in time, but their purpose, their need no longer exists. I think you have to put everything on the table. I think you have to put everything because it's a cost. Somebody is going to pay the tab, okay? And I think everything needs to be placed on the table and reviewed.
Any other panelists?
I would agree generally with that concept, but primarily toward the direction of simplicity. You know that a tax code is getting burdensome when you get all these exemptions and complexities in the code, and certainly we see that at the federal level, where I think our tax code is now some 14,000 pages. The challenge is that you need to get to a tax code that is easily understood and easy to implement. And certainly in the case of Texas, our business franchise tax is anything but. In many cases with smaller businesses, the cost to comply with the tax will actually exceed the tax because the tax is complex to administer. So what tends to happen is interest groups will come to lawmakers and will ask for breaks, and they get layered into the tax system. And over time, the tax system becomes more and more burdensome. And again, you see that mainly at the federal level, but to a certain degree at the Texas level as well. And so what we need to do is periodically move to simplify taxes and eliminate exemptions so that everyone's put on a level playing field, and so government does not introduce distortive policies into the economy.
Anybody else? Okay. I believe we still have a question there.
Thank you all for being here today. Appreciate your time and your thoughts on this important issue. This question is directed to Representative Otto, but I welcome a response from anyone else on the panel. Representative Turner, being in the legislature as well, you might be able to speak to this. But you mentioned the willingness to have a debate on the strengthening of the spending cap. However, there were many bills this past session that were in appropriations to do just that, and they were not granted a hearing. Given that this next session go around in the 84th, we will have a new chairman of the Appropriations Committee. Do you believe that we will see any bills that 94% of Republican primary voters and a very large number of Democratic primary voters support to strengthen spending caps in Texas?
First of all, I think the discussion that needs to be had is how do you calculate cost, inflation and population growth. You don't add them together, you multiply them because there's a multiplier effect. So once you decide what is the proper way, then yeah, I think there should be a hearing on the definition of what we're going to constrain. But the debate ought to be about looking at, okay, if we do that, what do we do if? Because the population is growing at 1,200 people a day that are still coming to this state. We have transportation needs that right now I don't know how we're going to meet them because there's not a political will to do anything to fund them. You're going to have to find cuts in the budget or redirect existing revenue if you want to try to do additional funding for transportation. And I think everybody has agreed that we need to address that issue this next session. Water kind of got taken care of. The voters approved the transfer from the rainy day fund. But to answer your question, I mean, I haven't seen the bills. No one's filed any new ones yet. I certainly don't have a problem with looking at it. I just want an accurate discussion of what the limit is and how you're calculating it.
And I would agree with what Representative Barr tried to say. I do know that during the legislative budget process, the legislative budget board that meets prior to the session starting, we do have that discussion, and we do try to take into account. I mean, there's several different categories that we are given that we can select from being very conservative projections in order to make sure that that we're leaving revenue on the table. But again, I'm just one of those five. You know, my opinion on it doesn't carry much weight. So you know, I'm just there as an observer.
And I'm not, and I'm not one of the five.
Yeah. Any other questions? I'd like to mention the subject that was brought up on the spending cap. We've advocated for making a change, maybe picking the lower of 3, but it causes me to think. That makes the argument or makes the assumption that we're doing everything at the right level now. And I think that's a debate, and that's a difficult debate to have. But I think that's the debate worth having, as to what is the proper level of government spending. And I think with new blood coming into the legislature, maybe some new chairs, a new governor, all those I think bring in ideas, and I'm encouraged to think that maybe this next session we can have that debate and really start looking at kind of truing up, and then as we either increase or decrease in a particular level, we have a base to work from. Now, is it something that's static? It will always be dynamic because needs change. But I'm pleased to have had this panel today to talk about this issue. We came here as friends. We're leaving as friends. We're going to work together for the good of you folks out there. Would you help me thank the panel?